Good evening. Before I introduce myself, I would just like to go over the chat function that we'll be using this evening in order for you to ask a question during the talk. At the bottom middle of your screen, you should see a little chat box. If not, simply wiggle your mouse and it should appear. Simply click on this box and it will open up a side box. At the bottom of that, the cursor should appear for you to type your question. Type your question, and once the presentation is finished, I will ask Susan the questions that have been asked in the chat box. If you want the chat box to disappear, just simply click on the chat box again. I hope that makes sense. So good evening, my name's Leslie Jack. I'm the Office Manager at Clackmannanshire Third Sector Interface, CTSI for short. I am also the Clackmannanshire Tapestry Coordinator. For those of you who don't know, we were instrumental along with the Council to bring the Great Tapestry of Scotland to Clackmannanshire in 2017, where it was displayed from May until August in the Spear Centre in Alva. At the end of the project, we had a little bit of funding left, so my boss, CTSI's Chief Officer Anthea Coulter, thought it would be an amazing opportunity for us to ask Andrew Crummy, the artist and designer of the Great Tapestry of Scotland, if he would design Clackmannanshire our own panel. Andrew was absolutely delighted at this, but one panel soon turned into 5 panels as Clackmannanshire was bustling with so many industries we couldn't fit all the wonderful history into one panel. I'm pleased to say that the 5 panels are well underway being stitched and they are looking absolutely stunning, and they'll be a huge asset to Clackmannanshire. To go alongside the Clackmannanshire Tapestry, we thought it would be a great opportunity to delve into the historical archives and have some fantastic historical talks to remind us of the rich history we had here in Clackmannanshire, and I'm delighted to be working alongside Susan Mills. Susan was Clackmannanshire Council's Museum and Heritage Officer from 1999 to 2017. She is a Director of Clackmannanshire Heritage Trust and a Trustee of Dollar Museum. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll now pass you over to the wonderful Susan Mills.
Thank you very much. It's very embarrassing to be called wonderful. I'm not, but thank you. Yes, it's this is the second time I'm doing this. I did the first one last night, so I'm hoping it's going to be a bit different. I don't think there might be someone who joins us later on who had to leave early last night. Yeah, we planned a whole programme of talks which should have happened in April and May and obviously couldn't happen in various places around the county. So this talk that I'm doing tonight, last night and tonight, is the first of those, and we're just trying it as an experiment to see if it works as a Zoom lecture, and we might do some more as we go along. So what I'm going to tell you now what I'm hoping to do tonight. I won't be the least bit offended if you have to go early or whatever, or you get sick of it. I hope that you won't, and there are lots of pictures to show you, and I'll start now. Can you all hear me well enough?
Yes.
Yep, great, okay. So tonight, what we're looking at, it can't be comprehensive, there's just too much to cover, so it's a flavour of the story. We're looking at the industrialisation of the Hillfoot villages of the county in the late 18th century and 19th centuries, where wool spinning and weaving had for a long time, for centuries, been just a domestic industry. And wool preparation and walking, I explain about that, was done by women. Some people will know what walking means already, but others might not. And the wooden hand looms were generally operated by the men. And in the later 18th century, this is just a summary of what I'm going to be saying, the force of the swift-flowing burns began to be harnessed to power the wheels to drive large numbers of looms in new mill buildings, and quite often the roles of men and women were reversed. The inventions for the textile industry in England spread widely and rapidly, and large mills were established in Menstrie, Alva, and especially in Tilikutri. And I'm going to talk about how those villages developed over time. And in contrast with that, there was what happened with dollar, which developed in quite a different way, has a different story to tell. So I'm now going to share the screen with you. There'll be just a minute, or well, a few seconds before that happens. And there we are. Okay. Right. Can everyone see it? Yes? Okay. The sources for this research, and really it's not, I have to say, it's not original research. Other people have done this before, and I've just pulled material together which may not have been all seen together before until now. We have early and of course the Ordnance survey maps, and you'll see some of those shortly. We have the statistical accounts. These were done around about in the 1790s and also in the 1840s and again in the 20th century. The early ones are a particular interest to us. They were done for every parish in Scotland, and they were usually done by the minister of the parish on the grounds that he, because it was a he, would know the area better than anyone else and would maybe have the time to, and would be literate enough to write it all down as well, and would have the time to research it too. Occasionally, as in the case of Alva, John Francis Erskine of Alva Tower did a lot of the work for it as well. He wrote most of it, if I remember rightly, but generally it was the local minister who wrote them. And really it was the state of the parish at that time. Very, very useful information. Some of you will have looked at them already, I'm sure, and it gives it's a wealth of detail of how many people lived there, what was going on in the parish and so on. So they're very good. And of course the 1840s one shows how much everything had changed in those somewhat under 50 years since the previous one. So you have those. We've also got the later and business records where they've survived for some of the businesses, but sadly they're a bit few and far between, I'm afraid. And there's also, and I'll show you, you can possibly see this book here, there is a very good book written by Brian Park latterly of Page Park Architects in Glasgow, and it's called The Woolen Mill Buildings of the Hillfoots Area. And he wrote it as a postgraduate when he was given a scholarship at Stirling University to write the book and research it. And of course the great thing was he's an architect, obviously, he was training at that time, and he visited all of the surviving mill buildings, and of course there were a lot more in 1979 than there are now. Some of them were still operating as woolen mills at that time as well. So although it's all in black and white, there are some very good photographs of buildings which just aren't there anymore, and a lot of detail. He didn't get everything absolutely right. Now I'll mention a couple of things as we go along, but otherwise it's a very, very rich resource if you want to find out more about the buildings. And obviously he was surveying them and looking at the structures and so on in detail as well, which I won't be doing very much because we don't have time. So they're the main resources, I think. There's also very good bibliography in the back of his book, which is useful too. Okay. The Ochils, always like this picture because it shows the contrast of the flat, what looks like in this view, relatively flat karstland of the county, and then the hills to the in the northern part of the county. Obviously this is Alva here and the Hillfoots along here, and they're not all there. That Menstrie sadly is off the picture. This is Alva. There's Tilikutri. Dollar is somewhat hidden up there, and Muckett, which we're not talking about because it never developed. By the time you get to Muckett, the water's not flowing fast enough to use it to build up an industry. So we'll be focusing on Menstrie, Alva, Tilikutri and Dollar today. But as you can see, the hills are cut by the glens coming down, the burns coming down through the glens. And we know that there was prehistoric settlement along here, along the Hillfoots, and there's no settlements, but burials have been found along the Hillfoots. So we know that people were living there for a long time. Not surprisingly, settling as close as they could to the fresh water supply around the burns. And aptly named Hillfoots, they're not actually on the flat ground, and the floodplain was wider in the past than it is now, although, as you know, it still floods when we have a huge amount of rain. The settlements were slightly off the level ground, better located, you can see what's going on, it's safer, and so on and so forth. So they generally were, the settlements started just up the slopes away, but still on the lower land. Okay. By the later Middle Ages, some of these settlements would have been forming into what they're called firm towns or farm towns, with a cluster of cottages and small holdings, and some of them gradually developed into villages, but there were also other outlying farms as well, which stayed as farms up the glens and further south, nearer to the River Devon. And these maps here, I thought I would just show you these. This is by Adair, 1681, and you can see Menstries there. The spellings are a bit erratic, the hills look very peculiar, but anyway. Menstrie, Alva. You will also notice that some farms are already there, established by then, and that's the village of Alva, such as it was by then. And then you have Tilikutri here. This is meant to be Tilikutri House. There was a building there long before the house that some people might remember in Tilikutri that was demolished in the 1960s. And there were two, it wasn't really one settlement. There was Westerton, which you can see there, and then Easterton of Tilikutri. And then you have Castle Campbell up there and Dollar here, very, very small indeed. And the River Devon snaking its way along further south. This is Stobie's map of 1783, so a whole century later. Cartography had come on by leaps and bounds by then, and you can see a lot more detail here. And again, you have Menstrie here, and the silver mines noted on there, as you can see. Alva, a proper settlement has started. There is Alva House and the grounds there. And then you have Tilikutri House there, named on this map, west of Tilikutri, and then east of Tilikutri over here. And again, Castle Campbell up in up Dollar Glen, and Dollar there more established. And the spellings have become more standardized. I'm not going to talk about the rest, but Gartmore Dam is over here. Great map. We could probably spend the whole talk session looking at this map, but we won't, obviously. So, as I said, the woolen production was entirely domestic. The women prepared the fleeces and cleaned them and so on and so forth. And they also did a lot of the in-betweens processes as well. And just because this picture is on, they also washed the finished bolts of cloth, and you can see those there. And as I said it last night, and I'll mention it, some of you will undoubtedly have seen Outlander, I would imagine. And there is a scene in I think the first season of Outlander where the heroine encounters in the Highlands a group of women, and they are walking, that's W-A-U-L-K, it's called fulling south of the border, walking the cloth. And they used urine in the Outlander. They make a big thing of it being their own urine, and but you could use animal urine as well. And they used that to soften the cloth, and then of course it had to be washed very thoroughly to get rid of the pong. So this shows you a number of the processes going on, being done by the women. The women also teased the wool, the raw wool there. That's probably taken, photograph taken in either the Highlands or in the Western Isles. That's in the Highlands too. And this is called a muckle wheel. It was a giant spinning wheel. And then this is a smaller, more a compact one a bit later on. And this model, which some of you will have seen photographs of before, was made for Fleming and Reed, which was later absorbed, Greenock, which was later absorbed into the Patons and Baldwin's empire. And it was made for the Glasgow Empire exhibition in 1938, and then used later on. Patons and Baldwin's added this sign over the top of it. And you can see here a cottage not unlike this one with a thatched roof, and the little girl is teasing the raw wool with the teasel pads, which they did. It's called teasing because they often did use actual teasels until later on they started using wire, of course. And the woman is spinning the wool that the girl is preparing, and then this lady is winding the spun wool on the winder, and that's what this lady's doing as well, with a winder. Is very similar to this. These two photographs are supposed to have been taken in Alva, but I just don't know quite where. So all of that preparation was done by women in the domestic setting. And then the cloth, the yarn, the resultant yarn was woven by men generally into fabric. And this, some of you will remember the Mill Trail Visitor Centre when it was in the former Glen Mill. This loom was made by Thomas Kennedy of Gala Shields. You can see makers of hand looms, witches and shuttles. I'm not sure what the witches are. Don't ask me, because I can't tell you that. Look it up. I'm sure it'll be there on Google to find out. And this was a wooden, pretty well entirely wooden loom. There's obviously some cast iron parts, but mostly wooden. And that's just to show the warp and weft threads, which I'm sure you're all aware of. This is a weaving shed, probably attached to the weaver's house in Kirriemuir. And as it says, hand loom weaver at work, Kirriemuir. And this is a lady hand loom weaver working in what looks like a corrugated shed, probably on Lewis or Harris, I think, there. One of the things that, before we move on, the fabrics that was made in the county, allegedly from about the 1560s, was Tilikutri serge. And that was made with a worsted, a fine smooth yarn spun from combed long staple wool. That's what worsted meant. Warp, and a coarser yarn weft. And that was being made from the middle of the 16th century, maybe earlier. And it's been suggested that it was first made due to the influence of Flemish refugees. I don't know whether it's probably not possible to prove that at all. The fact that there was a good local supply of wool because people were keeping sheep on the Ochils, mainly Scottish black-faced sheep, which were bred initially in the Tweeddale. And there was a good local supply of wool from them. And it was also supplemented by the women in the county going all the way to Edinburgh and buying extra wool to bring back. Sometimes they would buy a stone of wool and carry it back on their backs. So that they were bringing extra wool in to boost the quantities that they had. And it's said that the Tilikutri serge was sold for a shilling sterling a yard on average. They also made at that time other products like plaids and so on in Alva, but Tilikutri serge was regarded in the 18th century as the best quality fabric cloth to be had. Okay, so then this picture shows the start of the Industrial Revolution in the Hillfoots. It's just it's no mill in particular, but it just shows you the creation of a large mill building and the bringing of water. It has a wheel on the side of the building, and an aqueduct, a wooden aqueduct, is bringing water to turn the wheel. And this is called an overshot wheel because the water, instead of coming along a lade at ground level, more or less, and turning the wheel underneath, this is turning the wheel by the water coming over the top. And that really, it all depended on where the mill was built. And these mills, once they were built, you could accommodate a lot of those wooden looms, which you can see here. There's a whole row of them. I'm not going to try and count them, but you can see them all running along there. And they, by and large, as I've said, it was the men who operated the looms in sheds next to their cottages or within the cottage itself. They were very reluctant. There was resistance when the mills started to be built, because they were reluctant. They thought their livelihood was going to be taken away, because they were, instead of being independent and working for themselves, they were going to have to work for someone else. Women seem to, at the beginning, to have been more pragmatic and did go and work, were willing to work in the mills, and therefore learned how to operate the looms as well. And eventually there was, it settled down, and there was a mixture. Generally women did operate the looms, although you can see in this picture that there are several men in the picture, their jackets hanging up down the sides, as you can see. But by and large, women, once the mills had started, women operated the looms, with men ensuring that they ran efficiently and properly. I just want to talk about the Industrial Revolution a bit. In the 18th century, the developments that happened mainly in Lancashire were for the cotton industry. And just to quickly go through some of the inventions that there were, this is Hargreaves, James Hargreaves' well-known water-driven spinning jenny. And that was, he invented that in 1765, and it enabled a worker to use at first 8 spools of yarn, and later it increased to 120 spools, which speeds up the work considerably. The more famous Richard Arkwright, he invented a bit later on the water-driven spinning frame, which is, you can see here, and that enabled, the yarn from this machine wasn't particularly strong. This enabled much stronger yarn to be used, to be produced. The spinning mule was invented in the 1770s by Samuel Crompton, and this self-acting one, which means it could be set and was automatic, was patented in 1825. You will notice some of these are all wooden to start with. I think these are clearly, this is cast iron, and so on, much so that generated a whole industry in itself to make these machines as well. James Watt, we cannot not mention him. He improved Thomas Newcomen's steam engine, which was initially designed for pumping water out of mines, with the addition of a separate condenser in 1778. I'm sure some of you know that he was from Greenock. He did a lot of his experiments to start with at Kinneil, and is the little cottage that he's said to have worked in, and one of the initial engines is standing outside still. But he was in partnership with John Roebuck at first, and then it failed, and he then joined up with Matthew Boulton in the Midlands. And the Boulton and Watt steam engine was invented, was finally created in 1778, and it improved the efficiency of the engines, of steam engines. They could be smaller, and therefore they could use less coal. And that steam engine made him a very wealthy man, and it also had many applications as well, including variations of it could be used in mills. So all of these inventions enabled the industry to develop in many parts of Britain. And what happened, how did it affect the Hillfoots? That's what we're going to find out now. There were also the invention of power looms as well. And you can see that there, another huge machine which speeded up the weaving process. And this weaving loom here was also in the Mill Trail Visitor Centre once upon a time, and it was made in Keighley in West Yorkshire for specifically for the Harris tweed industry, in fact. Initially hand operated, you can see the pedals there, later on electrified as well. And this is a mill, I think this was in Sochi actually, but you can see some very large long looms here. weaving, and the quite substantial numbers of them, and obviously very noisy environment. There's all sorts of things of social side of it which we can barely touch today, but these mills needed to be extremely well built, or should have been anyway, to cope with the weight of all of this machinery, especially on the upper floors. And the noise must have been tremendous with all these belts. You see these belts running down here, all wheel belt driven. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Could talk about that for a lot longer, but we don't have time. And I'm now going to look at the settlements. So we'll start at the west and work our way eastwards. So here is the first edition Ordnance Survey map of Menstrie. Excuse me. Just before that, in the statistical accounts of 1795, excuse me, I'll just have a little drink. The parish of which was Menstrie and Alva combined, Menstrie didn't have its own church, and if you look here, there is no church as far as I can see in Menstrie in that point. It was a small parish. Most of the land was owned by the Erskine family. Well, sorry, not in 1795. It was owned by the Johnstons by then. The Erskines, the Bruces had had the estate, the Alva estate, and possibly part of the Menstrie area in the 17th century, and the Erskines had acquired it after 1636. And we have a certain amount of information. A lot of it was farmland, and you can see here there's Lipney Farm up the hillside. There was also Loss further up Menstrie Glen, and various other farms as well. There was in the county at that time, it was largely agricultural. There was some coal mining, however. I'll just mention that now in case I forget later. The shores of Sochi seemed to be the first to have mined in coal in 1510, but the amount of mining that was done was very variable until the 19th century. And in the 18th century, in the Hillfoots, there really wasn't a great deal going on. It was more towards Sochi and also obviously around Alva, on the Alva estate. The Erskines were instrumental in developing the coal mines on their estate around Alva. So looking at this map here, there were only ever 3 mills in Menstrie, and you can see it's quite small. This, by the way, is what everybody still calls the back road here. There's the bridge, which is still there over the Menstrie burn. And the settlement had grown up, as I said, slightly up the hill, off the flatter land to the south. And so there was, still in 1795 at least, still just this road. That was the only way to get along the Hillfoots. But in 1807, this toll road was built further south on the flatter land, and that, of course, is now the A91. So that had been created in 1807, improved communications tremendously, east-west. And by the time this map was done in 1862, you've got here a carding and spinning mill here on the east bank of the burn. Here's the burn running down. And they would be a takeoff from the burn, a lathe coming into the mill and operating the water wheel to start with. And that was established in 1800. 3 brothers from Tullibody, John, William and Robert Archibald, they came to Menstrie and set up this little mill. Robert and William left later on and went eastwards to to Alva, and then later to Tilikutri. But John Archibald and his sons Andrew and Peter continued with it. And it was added to, extended in 1810. They made yarns, they spun yarns, and they made blankets. And by 1834, it's the first, they were using steam. It seems to be the earliest record of steam being used in the county, as well as the water power. They used both. Because a lot of the mill owners said that the power of their water wheels diminished, obviously, not surprisingly, when it was very dry. So the force, the horsepower of the water could vary tremendously. Could be 8 horsepower when it was wet, down to 4 horsepower when it was dry, and that's not very reliable really when you're trying to run a business. The mill was, I'll come back to that in a minute. That's just to help you get your bearings. Menstrie Place is what we call Menstrie Castle now. And then looking at the second edition Ordnance Survey map, you can see, this is 1899, you can see how much the village has grown. It's still not huge, but it has grown quite a bit. You still have the carding and spinning mill here. You've also got Elm Bank Mills, which was founded in 1864 by Drummond and Johnston. It had apparently a very brief boom time, and but by the time it was taken over in 1905 as a furniture manufacturer, it had dwindled away. It was gas operated actually, and you can see it's not really, it's not near enough to the burn, and also gas was available, it was more reliable and so on as well. The surviving building, which I'm going to show you in a minute, is this one, and it wasn't the earliest one. The earlier ones have all been demolished. It ceased to be a mill, I think, in the 1970s, or maybe a bit earlier. Certainly the buildings were demolished in the 1970s. We know very little about Forthvale Mills, and there are no photographs that I've ever seen of it either. This is that surviving building, just 2 stories with attic. Quite typical. You always get loads of windows in a mill for obvious reasons. You need a lot of light to operate all the looms and so on, and all the machinery. So that's Menstrie. We're moving now to Alva, and again, this is the first edition Ordnance Survey map. Even in 1795, when the first statistical account was done, Alva was still quite small and very, very rural, agricultural. Alva House is off the picture, off to the east. Sir John Erskine had encouraged the growth of the village in around about 1700 by letting off land to tenants, and 2 rows were created around what became known as Green Square, which you can see here. It survives as an open space. Those of you who know Alva will know it. And the Baptist church, which is actually shown here, is in it. But only 2 rows were ever built, as far as we can see, initially. And then later on, Sir John's nephew, Lord Alva, in the 1760s, he hewed out some more plots of land to encourage more people to settle. This is called Back Row, now of course called Clark Street, along here. And by the time this map was done, there were quite a lot of mills. So there's the upper Strewed Mill. There's a bit of confusion because the building that everybody knows today as the Strewed Mill was actually that one, and it was part of the Bowl Mill, just to cause confusion. The upper Strewed Mill was up here right at the top, and then the lower Strewed Mill around in this area. Of course, Rodder's farm's still there to this day. This is all covered with housing now. But you can see this was all part of a large complex of buildings. And this one, excuse me, there were up to about 16 mills in Alva, not all at the same time, in fact. They all changed ownership, they went out of business, they were revived and so forth. I think it was always probably a fairly precarious business, subject to changes in fashion and also market and general economic volatility as well. But we do know that by 1830, 9 mills were driven by water wheels in Alva. I'm just going to go through those mills now. The earliest one was probably this Bowl Mill. And in fact, a few years ago, as part of the Ochils Landscape Partnership, Alva Heritage Trust and I cleared out an area here, round about here, and found what we thought was the wheel housing for this, somewhere in around this position here. But I've never seen any photographs of this building because they were all the later photographs, which you'll see shortly, it had gone by then. But I think this may have been one of the earliest buildings, and it was probably built around about 1795 to 8. It was owned later on by this man, William Drysdale, who is buried in the old kirkyard in Alva, and eventually owned 3 mills. And he was also one of the founders of Alva Games. He's on the poster that was done to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Alva Games, and he was one of the founders. So he was one of the leading lights in the manufacturers in the town. And in 1886, he actually wrote an account, which he presented, I think, at a meeting in Alva, going over the history of the development of mills in Alva itself, which is a useful document as well. This one, the original mill, or part of it up here, was destroyed by fire in 1836 and then rebuilt. And it was water driven with a 10 horsepower wheel as well. And a fine weaving shop was added later on too. There's also a mill, there are a few mills, we just don't know where they were. The Burn Mill, or the Burnt Mill, because it kept on burning down apparently, and locally it was just known as the Burnt Mill. Built in 1801, but we don't know where it was, and it's not shown on this map. Names may have changed as well, we just can't be sure. Braehead Mill, you can see there on this map here. Now, for those of you who know Alva, this row of cottages and this row are still there. I'm sure you're aware of that. So that was located behind those cottages. The chances are these were weavers' cottages, in fact. So that was located there. And that was built in 1802 by William Drysdale, by this man, and added to in 1820. And it was also water powered. Drysdale eventually owned the Ball Mill, and as I said, and Braehead Mill, and also he owned Island Mill, which you can see there, and that was Island Mill, and of course was has been since the 1970s the Masonic meeting hall in Alva. And the result of that was that Brian Park, whose work I mentioned earlier, he couldn't get in to survey the building because it was the Masonic hall. I think they probably let him in now, but they didn't then. So he was only able to survey the outside, and he got a bit muddled because he confused that with Braehead Mill. There's no information about the date of this building to start with, and that was clearly, you'll see on the next map that it was that building is not this one. The building that's this building has appeared by the 1899 map, so it was a bit later on. Probably built in the 1870s or 80s, perhaps. As I've said, there was also other mills that we just don't know where they were. Was John Harrower's mill, Horse Mill, John Archibald's mill, but all built between 1807 and about the 1820s, but we don't know the locations. I'll just point out now, Cobra Mill. We'll come back to the Strewed Mill in a minute and the Ball Mill in a minute. Cobra Mill is the only one that was nowhere near the burn, because here's the burn coming down through the town. Cobra Mill is there, and it was built by the local miller in 1838. 3-story building, carried on until it was in 1855 it became the Cobra Dyeing Company, and the building was there. They were still there in the 1970s until 1974 they moved to new premises and the building was demolished. I think it's covered by housing now. You will also see the Bridge Mill, about which we know practically nothing down here, nearer to the toll road, and also Greenfield Mill here and the Meadow Mill, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, and some aerial views looking up the Glen, taken in the late 50s, early 60s, I think. You can see the Strewed / Ball Mill building up there, but a lot of houses, these were built post-war, all of this area here, so that was altered. Braehead Mill has gone, it was in this area and it's gone. And this is the Island Mill, the building that we see today. The original building was over here, and here's Clark Street. A lot of these houses later on, not the ones here, would have been used by people, built by people working in the mill. And then we have this lower Strewed Mill complex, the upper Strewed Mill complex. Some of that had gone by the time this photograph was taken. And then there's the building that everyone knows as the Strewed Mill now, with various other buildings to the west of it. This was established around 1827. And by the way, while this is on, all these houses, these all belong to the owners and managers in the mills in Alva, and of course they have all survived, I think, without exception. In fact, they're all still there today. This advert, very nice. I think it's a bit battered. I think it was probably in a wool shop window, probably 1930s, photographed from an aeroplane, it says, and that's the lower Strewed Mills, which Archibald's, it was established by the Archibald family, the ones who'd come from, started off in Menstrie originally, and it was owned by them right through into the 20th century, as you can see. And this gives you an idea of all the different yarns that they produced. I haven't time to dwell on it at the moment, unfortunately. Some patterns from the 1950s, Alva knitting wools by William Archibald Son and Company Limited, Strewed Mills, Alva. Very much of their time, I think. And that was the building when it's looking rather forlorn, when it had a lot of the other buildings, the rest of the building of the Strewed Mill had gone and been demolished by then, and there it is, just standing on its own. It was said to have 365 windows in it. It's very sad, but I actually counted them a few years ago, 344, so still a goodly number, but not quite the one window for every day of the year, but very nearly. And again, 6 floors, you need a lot of light to operate all of that machinery, all of those looms and so on. Also, often the floors in these mills were made of maple, Canadian maple, because it's extremely strong and can support the heavy weights of the cast iron machinery. And there it is, not exactly today, a few years ago, but it looks the same now. It's the one building that has survived of this big mill, this big complex that used to be there at the top of Alva. And it's been converted a long time ago into flats. It used to have a bell up in that oculus, and also a clock, which is no longer there either. It was latterly used until Archibald's until 1964, and then it was eventually bought over by Raymond Hodgson and Company, which also took over Oakle Vale Mills later on as well. And that's the back of it. This is such as a big archway here, because the carts and wagons used to go through into the yard at the back. You can see it a bit more clearly there, and there were buildings attached to the running off at angles from the back of this building as well. That's Alva in 1899, and you can see it has grown considerably, and you also have the addition of the Johnston Park and so on, given by the Johnston family during the 19th century. So it's increased quite substantially, and a lot of that is due, well, almost entirely to the mills, the development of the mills. You still have, it's now called Island Works. There's the building that's there now, and there's the original mill building. Brayhead Mill's now become a laundry by then. These obviously are all still working up here. Bridge Mill, again, know practically nothing about it. And then we come down here. I'm going to talk to you about this little building on the corner of Brook Street and Henry Street in a minute. But while this is on, you can see Oakle Vale Mills there, and that was established. I'm having to look, I cannot remember all the dates, I'm afraid, sorry. And I'm having to just check for those who want the dates. Yeah, founded late 19th century, again by William Archibald and Sons. And it closed in 1964, just like the Strewed Mill did, and then was acquired by Raymond Hodgson. And Hodgson were running it right up until it closed in 2004. So it was still there, and many of you will remember it if you lived there. And that is the I've just temporarily forgotten Brookfield Mills. That was Brookfield Mill there, which was being used for dyeing by the time this map was done in 1899. And the other ones we're going to talk about a little bit, Burnbrae Mills here, Springburn and the Meadow Mills, and we'll focus on that in it shortly. This is the little building that I mentioned on the corner of Brook Street and Henry Street, a handloom weaving shed. Brian Park, who had a chance to look at it all before it was converted into flats, thought that it was probably early 19th century, had wooden columns instead of cast iron ones, and it's much smaller scale. Nothing is known about it at all. Probably the manager's house was there on the end there. And then there was the Burnbrae works of John Gray, which was established in the I've lost my little note. Here we are, 1867 by John Gray and Company. And that was handloom weaving to start with the addition of power loom later on. Quite substantial number of buildings. I love this letterhead because it's got telegram shawls, which shows you what one of the things they were making. Telephone number 4. That was all. There would be one of the few businesses, few places in the town that would have a telephone number. And that, looking down Henry Street, that was the Burnbrae works down there, and on both sides actually of the street. And that's a similar view looking down a few years ago. That building is that one, I think, and it has survived and again been converted into flats. Meadow Mill, a very interesting story to tell. That the family tradition of the Porteouses was that it was established in 1822. Brian Park, looking at the business records, which are in, I think, the University of Glasgow now, say it started in 1839. So anyway, early 19th century. And it was the largest mill in Alva, and it was known as the Leviathan locally. 6 generations of the Porteous family ran it until it closed. And this is for a letterhead, similar to the one you saw on the Burnbrae works just before, which Fiona Porteous still holds. And I've reversed it so you're seeing it as it was really laid out. Obviously, plates, copper plates like this are reversed so that for the printing. You can see it was very substantial. It consisted of a 4-story spinning mill, which is this one, and 2-story weaving shop, which I think is over here. And this is not part of that. It was part of a different mill, in fact. And James Porteous was the, this is James Porteous, Colonel James Porteous here and here. He took over, he was born in 1839, he took over and ran the mill from the age of 15 in 1854, and he was the driving force for the expansion through the 19th century. He was still a director when he died in 1932 in his 90s. This is his son, Major Archibald, Colonel Archibald Porteous, and his son, Major James Porteous. And he, with his wife, Emmeline Bailey, of Alva, the Alva pottery family, had 4 children. You'll see them in a minute. This is from the 1960s newspaper. George Duncanson of Alva at work on a pattern hand loom. It says over 2,000 patterns a year are made, and no 2 of them are alike. So he's at work within the mill at the Meadow Mill. They also, in the 20th century, the mill dealt mainly with Angora and wool, and they even bred their own rabbits on the premises. And this is the lady, I'm sure Fiona told me her name, and I can't remember it, sorry. She looked after the rabbits. This is a splendid specimen of a fluffy Angora rabbit, and they combed them, obviously, and used their fur to make into yarn. This is Alan Porteous, who was very much involved in the Scout movement in Scotland. And this is Emmeline Porteous, née Bailey of Alva. James Porteous, Ranald Porteous, Alan, and there was a daughter, Marie, who may have taken this photograph, probably taken in the 1950s or early 60s by the looks of it. And it was Alan who largely ran the business. And this photograph was taken in the mill, as you can see, 1961. And it says, he holds up one of the fine woven cloths produced at his mill. It is a beautifully coloured rug in Shetland and Cheviot wool, and they were very well known for being very soft rugs. Photograph probably taken at the same time in the mill shop. One of their inventions was Dream Touch, which I think possibly included Angora, but I might be wrong. It was maybe the mixture of the Shetland and Cheviot wool that gave it the softness. So this is this is a range of the shawls and rugs that they made, but it was by then, the 1960s, hard work, huge mill, fashions were changing and so on and so forth, and eventually in 1965 it closed down, and that was the end of that. And this aerial view shows you, this is Brook Street leading out of, and that's the Ball Farm here. There is the mill. This, as I say, was a separate mill over here. That, it might have been warehousing actually for this, but there was the Meadow Mill, and that was the Burnbrae Works up here as well. And if you keep that house, and this is the house that the Porteous family lived in, with a big garden here. If you keep those two buildings in mind, and then we switch to this aerial view from the 70s, 80s, there are those two houses. The big garden's gone, a lot of houses built in where the garden was. The mill has gone and has been replaced by Alva Primary School over here. And there's the burn running through here, and the remains of Burnbrae Works as well. I'm running late, much later than I was last night, I'm afraid. We'll see how it goes. Glen Mill, about 1874, much later than the other ones. Glen Mill, or Dalmore Works as it was well known as. The building was higher than it is now. It's been sort of truncated, and the former Dalmore School is behind up there. And this is a very late 1950s, 60s advert for Scottish Glentana Scottish mohairs, and a lady working in the mill when it was still running, probably taken in the 1980s, I think. A view from the other side, all empty at the moment as far as I'm aware. Used to have the Mill Trail, the second version of the Mill Trail Visitor Centre in there at one time, and then later uses as well. That's a view looking up towards Alva from the south. You see all the chimneys. This is the Meadow Mill here. That's possibly Cobble, no, that can't be Cobble Croop Mill. It's one of the other buildings. And you see the Strewed Mill up the hill. And this, I thought you might like to see these. The local artist Morag Knight was commissioned by Fenton's when they were doing Meadow Hill Opencast in the early 2000s to record their progress, and also some of the other industries in the county. And she did these oil pastels in Hodgson's, in Oakle Vale Works, these two women working, and also the warehousing as well, probably finishing garments. So we have this nice record of that, because that's also gone now completely as well. And a more recent view, where all the mill buildings have gone apart from the huge and very dominant Strewed Mill here. I'm conscious of the time. Is everybody happy to stay with me? I will crack on and speed up and get through it as fast as I can. But as I say, feel free to leave if you can't bear it any longer. Tilikutri, I'll just skip forward. It was, as I said at the beginning, gosh, yes, nearly everybody's still with us. It was two places. You remember the early map, the Stobie's map, there was Westerton, which was clustered, Westerton of Tilikutri, clustered around the burn, Tilikutri burn, which is running down here. Of all of the glens, I'd say the water force from Tilikutri Glen was the most powerful, well, is the most powerful. In fact, someone told me last night there's been rockfall again because of all the rain we've had. And we'll see a bit more of that later. And then there's Tilikutri House here. The original church for the village was in between the two settlements, was up here at the back of Tilikutri House there. And then there was Easterton of Tilikutri over to the east, probably nearer to where Harveston is, just to give you an idea. And again, the back road here running along a bit erratically in this area because of the break, because of the Tilikutri House estate, and you have the toll road running through down at the bottom of the hill, the A91. As you can see on the first edition map, it's too small really, I'm not going to linger too long on it. You can see that the town had grown quite a bit. And you'll notice the streets had been built at angles, angled against the slope to make them less steep and possibly for water runoff as well, I would imagine. And while this is on, you'll also see Devon Dale, the cartographer got that wrong, Devon Vale Mill was there, Tilikutri, the railway had come to Tilikutri by 1862, and also Devonside had been developed, and there were several mills there, which we'll come to in a minute. There's Menstrie Mill, I think you might just be able to see that there. And we'll go straight on to the next one, which shows what happened further up the Glen. To control the water force coming down the Glen, they built, a group of the mill owners, the mill builders and owners, built this big wooden dam. And there it is in 1920s. It had been rebuilt and repaired a number of times. It was built in 1824, excuse me, sorry, it provided a reservoir of water behind it, and it meant they were able to control the flow of the water coming through. That was it in the early 1980s, and I have a terrible confession to make, I have never climbed up Tilikutri Glen, so I don't know. Somebody told me last night that it is still there, and there have been some repairs, I think, but I'm happy to be corrected on that. And this drawing, painting, shows you the way things worked. So there's the burn coming down. These are all the mills. At one point, I'm skipping the early story of Tilikutri. We just don't have time, I'm afraid. That'll have to be done another time. But it developed, as did Alva and the others, when the mills were built. At the top, you have this huge Craigfoot mill. The only one, it was much higher. It was built above the burn, so it had to have an overhead timber aqueduct, bringing water from the burn to feed into it, and we'll see a bit more of that in a minute. There were 20 distinct mills built in Tilikutri. Again, we know a little bit more about where they all were. This, as I said, this water power system was established in 1824. The Craigfoot Mill was the third one to be built. There was a Walk Mill, actually we don't know where the Walk Mill was, in the late 18th century, built by Thomas Harrower. And then there was the Old Castle Mill, site of the Old Castle Mill. That was built around 1800 by John William and Duncan Christie. And that was the first spinning mill with a walk mill to be built. And that was taken over by Robert Walker and remained in his family for many years. There was the Middleton Mill, or Middle of the Toon Mill here, this complex here. And the Christie brothers, who built the Old Castle Mill, built this so they could expand. And that was eventually bought by Robert Archibald. See that name cropping up again. It carried on for a long time too. And Craigfoot Mill was built in 1806 by, again, William Archibald, so the same family. And the water supply, as I said, was fed in from the timber aqueduct. They built a new building in 1838.
Tara, Katie, dinner.
Oh, okay, right. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's the Middleton Mill at the bottom here, and we'll see that again. The Clock Mill there, which you'll see as well. This is the Castle Mill, the Newcastle Mill, which was built not that long after the Old Castle Mill, in fact. And the 1820, again, Andrew Walker, and that was it. If you look at that house there, it's still there today. At the top of, and there's the remains of Tilikutri Quarry up behind it. The burn ran through it, and you can see this is the site of it here, in fact. The Walker family, who I've mentioned several times, these mill owners, as time went on, in the boom time, they became very wealthy, well-to-do. Some were more successful than others. You can see here, they were getting grants at various times for expansion. This is 28th of June 1825. The Fisheries Manufacturers and Improvements Board gave George and Andrew Walker, the George Walker who's mentioned on this memorial, this gravestone here, a grant of £70 towards machinery which they'd installed at a cost of 682. And this Robert Walker is George Walker's son, and he put this very splendid monument up in Tilikutri churchyard in 1859 in memory of his father. That would be costly and shows a degree of wealth. While this is on, James and David Paton, who I'll come back to, they also got a grant of £70. So funding was available for expansion. That's Craigfoot Mill, which I mentioned, built by the Archibalds, and that 1838 they built this huge wheelhouse, and there it is showing this massive iron wheel which was fed and turned by the water coming from the aqueduct there. So that was a very substantial mill. And it was taken over by the sons of William Archibald, and they ran it, and they formed eventually J and R Archibald, and it was the two sons who built Devonvale Mills. This had quite a few fires actually at various times during the 19th century. The wheel operated into the 1920s, but the building was demolished in the 1930s. A view down the town, there's Craigfoot, there's Dawson's Mill, Newcastle Mill and the Old Castle Mill, and the Company Mill. There was some about which we know very little. There's the Clock Mill, middle of the town mill, and not to be confused with the Middleton Mill. This was a complex of buildings. And there is J&D Paton's mill over the other side of the toll road down there, and there's Devonvale Mill in the distance. Paton's, interesting, the two eldest sons of John Paton, the founder of Paton's in Alva, Paton's spinning mill in Alva, went off and did their own thing in Tilikutri, and they set their own J&D Paton mill up in 1824 and expanded systematically all the way through. They seem to have weathered the economic depressions and various things that happened right through the 19th century and well into the 20th. And this is just, while this is on, this was one of their main buildings, probably built in the 1830s, in fact. This just shows you how an accident, they were dangerous places. This is a record of probably a young girl working in the mill who got her arm trapped in one of the machines when she was working at it and broken at the elbow joint. That's just one example of probably many. These are some of the women and the young man who worked in J&D Paton's, probably at the end of the 19th century. Not sure where they worked, whether they were office staff or whether they worked in the mill itself. And J&D Paton's did very well. There's this letter inviting them to supply a lot of shawls, tartan shawls. Some of you will know that having been proscribed after Culloden, tartan became fashionable again after George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822, all masterminded by Sir Walter Scott, and then of course Queen Victoria popularised wearing of tartan as well. And at the Great Exhibition, which was again masterminded by Prince Albert in 1851, they displayed their wares. This is quite an order for shawls to be sent down to be displayed at the exhibition. They won a gold medal for their products at the Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace in 1851. So they did very well. They used steam and water power, using the burn and steam as well. And they made shawls, tartans and tweeds. They really mechanized on a big scale. I think some people might know, I think it closed in the early 1980s, possibly. It was certainly still operating when Brian Park did his survey. And this is one of the two surviving buildings. also converted into accommodation. The clock mill was built by James and George Walker in 1824, back up the burn again, and it operated until the late 1970s, early 80s, so called because there was a clock. Somebody told me it's not working anymore. Well, it's because nobody winds it probably, and it was the first place where the Mill Trail Visitor Centre was. On the 28th of August 1877, there was a terrible flood in Tilikutri. This is the clock mill, the side of the clock mill, and there had been a huge amount of rain for about a fortnight beforehand, and the hills were saturated, and it just got too much at one point on that day, early in the morning. And the dam that I mentioned was burst, and this torrent of water came thundering down, bringing lots of rocks and so forth with it, broke this bridge, which you can see. There's a modern version of it now above the clock mill, and did a huge amount of damage, as you can see, right the way down through down the burn side. That's part of Middleton Mills there. Took the side of this house off, or, well, actually it's probably part of the mill, and did a huge amount of damage, as you can imagine, well, as you can see. That was the side of the castle, one of the castle mills, just the whole side taken off it and destroyed. And the owner of that mill was standing on the bridge that you just saw, with one of his workers when it happened, and they were both swept away. And man was swept, another worker was swept away, he was rescued, but the mill owner, Mr. Hutchison, and his worker, and I'm afraid her surname, Isabella Blair possibly, they were drowned. He was found later that day, and her body wasn't recovered until a couple of days later at March Glen. So it was a very bad a tragedy that happened, and it was the start. By then, however, just to go back to what happened with these settlements, they all grew, particularly Alva and Tilikutri, grew faster. Just to give you an example, Tilikutri had 787 inhabitants in 1755. In 1881, so just a century and a quarter or so later, 5,544. That's a huge growth in that period of time. A lot of housing was built, not always of the best quality, and the infrastructure wasn't there to support the growing population, really. In 1852, an act came in to allow the creation of police boroughs. Alva was the first in 1854, followed by Alva in 1856, and in 1871, Tilikutri set up its own council. So by the time of the flood in 1877, Tilikutri Town Council was managing its cleansing, its gas lighting, and so on, and they took charge, and really the damage was cleared up in very quick time, now that the people were running themselves, really. This is the back of the clock mill, and it had a lade running. The water was taken off the burn and run through this lade, and there you see that coming along, and there is the scar of where the wheelhouse was. So the water was fed over the wheel again, just as on the Craigfoot mill. I think this is all gone now. This is quite an old photograph. And this is the interior of the clock mill after it had closed, being converted to be the first version of the Mill Trail Visitor Centre. And there's that loom that I showed you earlier on. At least I think it's that one. For whatever reason, it was later moved out of there and moved into the former Glen Mill in Alva later on. There's the burn, Tilikutri burn running down. I think all of these, the banks and revetment, were all done probably after 1877, and this terracing as well, to make sure they could control the flow of the water better and it wouldn't burst its banks again. Although people told me last night that it's been very high again in various places as well. That's where, after the water had gone through, had gone over the water wheel on the side of the clock mill, there it came back into the burn through this channel here as well. A view from the bottom near Stirling Street, looking up, you can see part of middle of the town mills here, weavers' cottages there. This is a corner of the office, I think, of Middleton Mills there. And there, a similar view of this big mill that used to stand here, as I said. And there's that building. It's up here on the corner up here. And the name Middleton Mills is still there on the entrance door. That one was built in 1836. Again, Robert Archibald and his 4 sons built that. And they leased middle of the town mill further up to tenants. Sorry. What's happened there? Yeah. So that's Tilikutri 1899. It doesn't look all that much bigger, actually, to be honest. A bit bigger, but no major expansion, particularly by then. And you can see Devonvale Mill over there, and also Devonside down here with some of the mills. And a nice view from the southeast looking, that's Devonvale House, which was still there when I first came up here at the back of Sterling Furniture Warehouse. That's the Oak Mill, which was established, I think, in the 1870s. But you get an impression of all those chimneys and all the mills still all operating round the turn of round about 1900 when this was taken. And a similar view, viaduct bringing the railway into the town, and Devonvale Mills there, and similar view with all of the mills still all functioning. I should just say, in case I forget, excuse me, that, oh, that's very appropriate. The workers in all of these mills were very politically active, and in fact in Tilikutri in 1837 there was the weavers' strike for better pay and conditions, mainly better pay, better hours and so on, and they did all go on strike for several days, and eventually the mill owners settled with them. I mean, they reached a compromise, as is usually the case, but that is an indication that they weren't frightened to go on strike. Sorry. This banner was made for Devonvale Works, as you can see, absolutely to carry in the procession of the franchise reform demonstration that was done in 1884 to increase the number of people who could vote. The event happened, there was a gathering the demonstration happened in the West End Park in Alva, and the workers processed from the Devonvale Works and no doubt from other mills in Tilikutri all the way to Alva, carrying this banner aloft. And it's a splendid thing, and it's made of silk and cotton, and it shows the painting was always done on silk, very, very delicate, of course, and prone to rot. But this shows the state of the mill at that time. And of course, that building is where all the furniture is today. That part of that survives. Some of these buildings have survived as well. A lot of this middle part has gone, but there's still a substantial amount of the original buildings still surviving. There's also another banner which was carried from Tilikutri to support the demonstration. And there you can see, there's that building there. And I think that's one of those little smaller buildings that I mentioned before. And some of these at the back there as well. So a lot of that mill has survived. It stopped being, it was, as I said, it was run by the J&R Archibalds. It started in 1846, and it was, they operated Craigfoot Mill and Devonvale simultaneously. Before I just go back so you can see that. And then they left Craigfoot completely in 1851 and operated out of this mill, Devonvale Mill then. This building's probably 1860s. In 1850s, they stopped making tartans and concentrated completely on tweeds. And in the First World War, as a lot of you will know, it was used as a barracks. And by then, they'd stopped manufacturing the tweed. In 1921, it was taken over by Samuel Jones, and it was a paper mill, I think, until the 1970s. In Devonside, there was Monteith Mill and the Bridge Mill, plus several others as well. But I'm going to skip over that from lack of time. So that's just, you know, a run through all the different mills that there were. as we work our way along the Hillfoots. Now, what happened in Dollar? Because Dollar has a very different story. This is the first edition Ordnance Survey map, and if you look very carefully, here's Dollar Burn here. There is a building there that says Woolen Mill, very clearly beside it. And we know there were other industries, the bleach fields further down near the River Devon to the south here, and a few others as well. And there was Dollar Mine, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't remember when that started, but not as early as this map, I don't think. So this is about 1862. Now, the reason that Dollar could have developed in a similar way, plans were drawn up, in fact, in 1836 by someone called James Home. He proposed 15 mill sites to the east of Dollar Burn and stepped down the hill all the way down here. Dollar started off up here. That was the original little village, not quite so far from Castle Campbell. So this is all new. Everything to the south, clustered around the toll road, is all much newer. And it could well have happened, but in 1802, someone called John Mcnabb, who was a local lad who'd gone off and made his fortune at sea. He died, never married. He left a bequest to a cousin, I think, but otherwise he left the bulk of his fortune, the interest from the bulk of his fortune, to found a school for the poor of the parish of Dollar, where he'd grown up. And he left this, the church heritors of the parish church, which was is there now, but the original church is, as you probably know, up here. And they didn't really know what to do with this. It's the equivalent of about £2 million in today's money, huge sum of money. Really didn't know what to do, so they just sort of sat on it from 1802 for quite a few years until a new minister, Andrew Milne, arrived as the minister of the church. Which of course was still this earlier church. This is a later church before his time, and after his time, sorry. And he was the driving force behind actually doing something to create this school. And he had a grand plan. He didn't want it to be any old school, a simple school. He drew William Playfair, who was the most fashionable architect in Edinburgh at the time, to design a splendid new school, which at this time was called Mcnabb School or Dollar Institution, and of course we now know it as Dollar Academy. And it was built in these, this land was acquired from the Tate family, I think, and this splendid and really remarkable new school was built. And that changed the character of Dollar completely, because it established a reputation for itself very quickly. It was free to start with, but the parish was quite small, and really lots of people, the better known the school became, the more people wanted to send their kids to it. And so more and more people started to move into Dollar, and that's how Dollar grew in size. So this is it, 1862, still. Well, then the school, which opened in 1819, had been there for quite a while, so that's why it's grown already. And it's said that the heritors actually actively discouraged any industrial development in Dollar, which is why none of the mills ever happened. So keep that little mill there in mind. It was built in 1818, water driven from the burn. It employed only 2 men, 4 boys and girls, and it was closed. It had closed by 1859, so not long, you know, it was on its last legs by the time this map was done. And that's Dollar in 1899. You can see how very dramatically it's grown, and it's all because, really, of Dollar Academy. Nothing to do with any industrial development. And if you look up there where that mill building was, it's now no longer a mill, a woolen mill. It's now called Castle Campbell Hall. And of course today it's half of it is Dollar Museum and the rest is flats. So the building's still there, but it hasn't been a mill for a long time. So that's how Dollar developed in a completely different way from the other Hillfoots villages. And that, just to give you an example, you can see the peak how the population peaked, rose considerably during the 19th century. Still rose in dollar, but for a different reason and not as much. And if dollar possibly had mill buildings, mills in it, it might have had a much bigger population than it ended up having. But that's just a helpful comparison. And just today, for your information, Alva has a population of 4,660, roughly. Tilikutri 599, so just under 6,000, and dollar 2,800. So not so very different from their peaks in the over a century ago. Okay, I've talked far too long. I'm sorry to have gone on for so long, and thank you very much for staying with me. I'll be happy to, because most of you have, happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sorry
Susan,
to go on so long.
No, no, not at all. I've been getting messages saying that you're so engaging, that everybody's been loving it. So,
right.
Does anybody, everybody, you can feel free to unmute yourself. Does anybody have a question for Susan that you'd like to ask?
Hi, it's Colin.
Hello.
Hi, Colin.
You've not mentioned anything about mining, really. The industry mining probably went on in parallel with the, well, certainly with the use of steam.
I did mention mining. I did mention mining actually, but not very much. And I said I wasn't. I think I said I wasn't going to say very much. It's a whole separate area, really. And I suppose with this, I wanted, particularly along the Hillfoots, to focus on the textile industry. Perhaps the title was a bit misleading, for which I apologise. But really, I would. Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Bye. Thank you. I really, I think it's a whole separate talk, actually, with the stories of how John Erskine and et al. Tried to do the mining and so on. And you could also look, of course, at the silver in the hills and cobalt mining and so on. Well, maybe you can do the whole thing in one talk, but, but I haven't.
It would take all day.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly. I've given a lot more detail tonight than I did. Thank you very much. I've given a lot more detail tonight than I did last night, and it's taken a lot longer. So sorry about that.
No, that's all right. I remember at school having my school jumpers had Alva Glen in the label.
Oh, did they? Yes. Well, there you are. Yes. Or Glen Alva, possibly.
Possibly Glen Alva.
Probably
yes.
Glen Alva Limited. They were at they were at Greenfield Mills, I think. Yes. Okay, right. I think I better put my glasses back on. Stunned.
Does anybody else have a question?
Where did the workers come from?
Oh, well, yes, indeed. Where did they come from? Because obviously they were coming from somewhere. I can't answer that question. I think they probably gradually moved in. And to do that, to tell you that, is something that maybe if I had more spare time or someone else might like to do, you'd really have to trawl through all the census returns. You could do a sample every, I think it's not worth doing it in 1841 because it's just not detailed enough. But if you work your way through from 1851 right the way through, you could pick up where people had come from. And I think possibly, definitely further west. I'm just desperately thinking of those two VC awardees in, the one, James Pollock, who lived in Tilikutri. I'm pretty sure his father came from the west of Scotland, just as one example. And I think he worked in one of the mills, actually. And that's just one example, obviously. But I think you'll probably find that people came from all over. It would be a great project to actually plough through all the census returns and pick that information up. It's something that would take quite a long time. So maybe one day.
That sounds like a PhD to me.
It does. It's not going to be my PhD, but I mean, it's something I've wanted to do in Alva for a long time. I would like to see how many Bohemian glass engravers. I did some of it a few years ago. Oh gosh, 10 years ago, for an exhibition, because they all lived in in Oakle Street for some reason. But just to pick up exactly how many more there were, and also how many people were working in the glassworks, they all lived down in Castle Street, just to see where they were coming from. Great, very interesting. It's just very time consuming as well.
And I think what was interesting from the pictures of the various mills is that the mechanisation retained the size of looms that were that the wooden looms were.
Yes.
Presumably because the size of cloth was standardised.
Yes, it was, and you'll have to forgive me. I know Harris Tweed is 36 inches, but the others I'm not so sure about. I can't give you that information. But yeah, there would be a standard width that was done. And it was only really on the wooden looms anyway, it was only really when all the cast iron looms came in. And even some of them, well, you saw the Harris Tweed one, that was the standard width. But other looms could be much, much longer and therefore weave much wider fabric. So the restriction was the size of the loom, and you could make it to any size you wanted, up to a point, I suppose. Alexandra, I saw your question. Well, you saw some of those patterns from Alva, from the Strewed mill. There aren't many of those around, although I suspect there'll be a lot in whoever's left that question will have to, I'll have to come back to that. Yeah, there are probably lots more of those patterns in people's houses. So if you know anyone who's got them, we'd be very interested. In contrast with that, with a few from the Hillfoots, there are loads. We've probably got almost every pattern that Paton and Baldwin's produced. Thank you very much. Bye. Yeah, so some have survived, some haven't. Who asked the other question? Somebody sent a question a minute ago, and
Nick Bramall's. Sorry, it's just gone too fast.
I noticed in your first photograph, the aerial photograph, you can see the remains of the railway bridge across the Forth.
Yeah.
It was interesting to know how the railway developed and influenced or had an effect on the mills, and you know what happened as it gradually became defunct.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the railway coming to Alva had a tremendous effect, because obviously a lot of goods could be shipped out of Alva that way. I'll try and answer Betsy's question. Have any mills reopened? Can I just answer that very quickly? No is the answer to that. Short, quick answer, sorry. But yeah, the railway, rather bizarrely, the railway went to Tilikutri. Golly, I'm trying to dredge this up. The railway came to Alva in, years ago. I knew this, it was in my head, 1850s. It went to Tilikutri in the 1860s, but strangely enough, didn't get to Alva. Another line was created which went round through Menstrie to Alva, and that was a bit later. So it seemed incredible to me that there was no joined up railway line that went from Alva to Tilikutri, different line. So the train ended, thank you, the train ended at Alva. And then it went on into Dollar. I think Dollar was the 1870s, if I remember correctly. And yeah, it must have had a tremendous given a boost to it made transport easier. Although they still did it by shipping, took the goods to Alva harbour, and it went out on ships and so on. But yeah, the railway had made a huge improvement to the speeded up communication, speeded up distribution as well. Yeah. Have I missed any other questions?
Nick had asked, he'd said about the mills, and he was asking if the mills were in competition with each other.
Yes, I suppose there were, and also Colin, as you can see this on thing. We'll come back to the Johnstons in a minute, Colin. Yes, I'm sure they all were in competition with each other. It must have been a pretty cutthroat business, except for the fact that all the mill owners, they would be all united against the workers when the workers went on strike. I'm sure there was that. no doubt. But yeah, it must have been very difficult when there were so many mills in the town. Perhaps they discussed it with each other, tried to make different products. Some made cashmere shawls. I forgot to mention this earlier, but there were various mills in Alva making cashmere shawls. Just a little story. There is a shawl that we have in the Heritage Collection, which I don't know which mill it was made in, but it was carried in a procession when the Wallace Monument opened in 1869, held aloft in the procession. It's very simple. It's sort of natural colour with a modest decoration along the edge, blue, I think, and red. And then it was raffled afterwards, and the person, someone called Rabbit Johnny, who worked on the Alva estate, won it, and it was handed down as a christening shawl right through each generation of his family, and then handed to us later on. And that's made of cashmere, very, very soft. So, you know, each mill would do what it could to better others and offer something that nobody else was offering. But yeah, I mean, they always say competition is the best thing because it drives, yes, Colin, competition was very complicated, a very boom. But yeah, I think the pressure, yes, always pressure. I think the whole business was very precarious, and that shows by the number of times these mills were bought by someone else, someone who was more successful. The Walkers, the Archibalds in particular, and the Patons, very successful businesses. Paton seemed to have weathered all the economic storms very effectively from when they started right through to when they closed eventually. And the reason why they all closed, too costly to run, changes in fashions. I mean, now I think people do like and appreciate hand woven or just understood economic cycles. Yes, indeed, they did. They bucked the trend. They just seem to have managed to be ahead of the game, really, in Patons, I think. Yeah, I think people just started to buy things in a different way, just in the same way that hand knitting became very unfashionable and is now fashionable again, but not to the same scale as it was before. What else did you say? You said something else, Colin, a little while ago, but I've forgotten. Anyway. Oh, the Johnstons.
The Johnstons.
Yes. Colin, I don't know whether you saw that, that Colin put a message on. Yes, indeed, it was the Johnston family. Well, it would be James Johnston, who was the JP MP by then in the 1860s. He allegedly didn't want the train running past in front of his estate, but, you know, the Alva house is a long way from where the railway line would have been. So whether this is just a, you know, an apocryphal tale or whatever, I don't know, but I know that's been said before. Right. Have we run out of steam?
Any other questions? No?
No? Okay.
I think the final death was man-made fibres.
Yes,
and the loss, you know, the woolen industry all over the world has collapsed because of the flexibility and of man-made fibres.
Yes, exactly. Even though now, you know, it's much more sound, environmentally sound and so on, to have natural fibres, and we are encouraged to wear them. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you very much, Donald. Bye-bye. Yeah, yes, you're right. And it's a shame because industries have gone as a result of the development of man-made fibres. Wonderful though many of them are, and probably what would we do without them? But, you know, it's the world, the economy of the world has changed as a result of it.
Did any of the mills develop cotton, move on to cotton away from wool?
No, I don't think they did, not at all, not here. And I'd be happy to be contradicted by anyone who knows otherwise. Thank you very much, James Hunter. Bye-bye. Good night. Yeah, I don't know. There's no cotton spinning at all in this area. There was, of course, over in the west, because Coates started, they were cotton spinners. I mean, the thread and so on, but not in Clackmannanshire, no.
Transportation problem, probably.
Pardon?
A transportation problem. If you've got to ship cotton in, you can't. It's not a local
Yes,
product.
that's true. You've got to bring it in. At least they had access to wool. Although I think, you know, by the peak of the industry, they certainly didn't have enough. They weren't getting enough wool off the backs of the sheep living on the ochels. So they were having to bring more and more and more wool in.
Well, it was coming down from the highlands.
Yes, of course, that's true. Yeah.
Following the clearances.
Yes, and coming in from all over, from other areas as well. Yeah.
Did the yeah, I was going to say the Hillfoot woolen mills, aside from obviously Harris and Lewis as well, did it have a mainland? Was it renowned throughout, you know, mainland Scotland and beyond then for high quality products, or did it compete then with other regions in Scotland as well to produce similar woolen garments?
I think, I mean, I can't really answer that as truthfully as well as I would like. I think they were probably producing different sorts of garments to some extent from others, carving out a role for themselves, a niche for themselves. It must have been one of the main areas, but then of course you have the borders as well. But the borders, Hawick and so on, and the border towns, they were, I suppose, they developed renowned for producing cashmere and so on, whereas this area didn't quite so much. But yeah, I think probably they were pretty well known. I have to say, you know, well, Donbros, I'd heard of Donbros. I haven't mentioned them at all. They were mainly Sochi, but in other places as well. Some of them were household, excuse me, some of them were household names, but not, happy to be contradicted, but I don't think any of them were, in the Hillfoots, were as well known as Paton, John Paton's Son and Company wool spinners, and then later obviously Paton and Baldwin. They were a worldwide household name, and indeed they had mills all over the world, which none of the ones in the Hillfoots ever had, to my knowledge. So I think they were modest domestic products, but probably never really carved out, perhaps certainly not an international reputation, but I could be wrong. But they would be well known at their time, and in the 19th century they would be, their goods would be all over the world. They probably just didn't put their any labels in them, you know, the way people did later. That's not, that's as best I can do, I think.
Yeah, that's good, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Is that everybody? I think we've kept Susan well later than what was planned.
Thank you. Well, I've kept all of you as well, so thank you for staying with me for so long.
Not at all. It was our pleasure.
Enjoyed it. It's a great way to spend a Friday evening. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, that's good to know. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely messages. And thank you, Colin. Yes.
Same time next week then.
Oh, well, maybe not quite. Same time, maybe next month. Yeah, we've got to discuss that yet, but it won't be about the Hillfoots. It'll be about something else in the county. Oh, Lorna, you've come back. Or have you been there all the time? Yes, after your walk. Mute. Bye-bye, those people who are going. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for coming.
Right.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye, Star.
Thanks, Leslie.
You're very welcome, Sinead.
Good to see you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Okay. Right. Bye-bye, Elizabeth. And Lorna. So, oh, she's gone. They've gone. Okay. Bye-bye, Brenda. She's gone, right? It's funny, you know. It
was very good. Enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you very much.
Enjoyed that.
Thank you. There's just so much, you know. It's too much. I did it really rather somewhat differently from last night.
Yep.
And it's just ended up with more really. But never mind. I'll not think about it now. Every time I do it, it would be different. So okay. Well, I'm bye bye.